Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Belen Bonilla, and I'm the Strategic Engagement Associate here at PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization conducting independent research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. We have a great conversation in store for you today about new survey findings from our latest survey report, LGBTQ Rights Across All 50 States, Key Insights from PRRI's 2024 American Values Atlas. And we have two excellent conversation partners here with us today. We've got the CEO of PRRI, Dr. Melissa Deckman, who is author of The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy. And we're also delighted to welcome back a former PRRI Public Fellow, Kelsy Burke. Dr. Kelsy Burke is a professor of sociology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and an award-winning author whose analysis on LGBTQ rights has appeared in The Hill, LGBTQ Nations, among other publications. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Dr. Melissa Deckman to walk us through key findings.
Thank you so much, Belen. I also want to thank Dr. Kelsy Burke for being here today. It's just great to have you back on our orbit after you've spent time being a public fellow. So let's go ahead and dive into the findings. We only have about 30 minutes or so in our conversation today, so let's just get right into it. So our survey is a 50-state survey plus the District of Columbia, where we look at Americans' attitudes on a variety of LGBTQ issues. This survey data was collected over the course of a year, starting in March through December, and we have a total sample size of more than 22,000 Americans, which is a really rich data source, which allows us to go into some deeper dives and analysis in the data that you typically don't see in most survey reports that come out. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. And we're going to start with a very brief profile of LGBTQ Americans. So we find that about 1 in 10 Americans identify as part of the LGBT community, with about a third identifying as gay or lesbian, 4% who indicate they're bisexual, and 2% who identify as something else. If you go to our survey report, which I strongly recommend at our website, prri.org, we actually go into much more detail about how we measure sexual orientation and gender identity in that report. I think it's also worth noting that identification as LGBTQ really varies pretty dramatically depending on when Americans are born, what generation they hail from. And so we find, for example, that roughly 1 in 4 Zoomers or Gen Z adults identify as LGBTQ, followed by millennials, about 13%. And that percentage sort of declines the older that Americans get in terms of their generational status. We also know that LGBTQ Americans identify at far higher rates of being religiously unaffiliated. So about half of LGBTQ Americans are express that they're a nun when they check on our survey what their religious affiliation is. And that's almost twice as much as Americans more broadly. And as a result, you'll, of course, if you look at the rest of the data in the figure, you'll see that LGBTQ Americans are a lot less likely to identify as Catholic, Protestant, or most other faith traditions. Finally, we see some variance with respect to where LGBTQ Americans reside by state. In fact, we see a low, for example, of 4% of South Dakotans indicating that they're LGBTQ in our survey, to a high of about 18% of District of Columbia residents who indicate that they are members of the LGBT community. But this kind of gives you a snapshot of where those folks live across the country. So let's get going and looking at support for different policies that we track pretty regularly at PRRI. So one question we ask pretty routinely is, do Americans favor or oppose non-discrimination laws for LGBTQ people when it comes to things like housing or job discrimination? And we find actually that the vast majority of Americans, 75%, 3 in 4, say that they do favor those sorts of non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ Americans. We also find, however, some party polarization on this issue, which is, you'll see this come up in quite a bit of our tables today, and if you read our report. I think what's notable is that when it comes to support for non-discrimination laws, a majority of Republicans support those, but that number hasn't really changed much in the last decade, whereas among Democrats, it's becoming far more uniform. So we went from 78% in 2015 to in 2024, about 9 in 10 Democrats favoring those sorts of non-discrimination protections. I think it's also worth bearing in mind, we are, of course, the Public Religion Research Institute, so we like to look at that sort of granular level of analysis where we look at how people of faith feel about different policies. And we find that most Americans of faith, the majority of Americans of faith, almost uniformly are supportive of those non-discrimination protections. We typically find, and this is again another pattern you'll see with the data, that Americans who hail from more minority faiths, whether they're Unitarians or Buddhist, American Jews, Hindus, tend to disproportionately have more support for, in this case, non-discrimination laws. But again, we're finding on this slide and the next, most Americans of faith broadly support those non-discrimination protections. I think there's only one instance, I think it's Jehovah's Witnesses, yes, where a minority of faith members oppose those sorts of non-discrimination laws. Again, similar to the other heat map you saw with respect to residency of LGBTQ individuals, we find some pretty big variance depending on where people live in America. From a low of 57% in Oklahoma, so that indicates that 57% of Oklahomans support non-discrimination protections, to a high of about 90%. And this past year, I think it was Vermont where we saw the most support for non-discrimination protections. But I think it's notable, again, that this is a viewpoint where most state residents are broadly supportive of those rights. It's important to remember that. But you do see on the West Coast and the upper Northeast, in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, much broader support for those protections than, say, for example, in the Deep South. So one thing we've monitored here at PRRI is whether or not Americans favor or oppose religiously based service refusal. So in other words, if you are a baker and you're asked to make a cake for a gay couple for a same-sex marriage, should you have the ability to refuse to do that if it violates your religious beliefs? So what we have found is that Americans have been remarkably similar with respect to their attitudes over the past decades. We first asked this question in 2015. We found about 2/3 of Americans oppose those religious refusals, which means that they don't think that businesses should be allowed to do that based on their religious beliefs, if it violates their religious beliefs. That's been remarkably similar over the past decades, still stands at 58%. We saw, of course, in 2015, when we first asked this question, some very big polarization along partisan lines. That has extended over the last several years as well. So now we find 83% of Democrats do not believe those small business owners should be allowed to refuse service, whereas it's only 35% of Republicans, and that's dropped from 40% back in 2015. Again, we find that most people of faith are opposed to allowing those small business owners the right to refuse service here, very much along similar trends that you saw before. And if you go to the next slide, however, we do see more, I think, more support for those exemptions or those religiously based service refusals by I think, a higher number of religious groups. So for example, we find that only 31% of white evangelical Protestants oppose allowing a small business owner the right to refuse based on religious beliefs there. But again, the overall religious picture is that most people of faith don't think that businesses should be allowed to refuse service based on their religious views. And again, we see the heat map shows some variance. And if you look at it from the perspective of state residents who are least likely to oppose those refusals, they tend to be, of course, in the Deep South and in the upper Midwest as well. Finally, we've been tracking Americans' attitudes about same-sex marriage for quite a while, even before Obergefell, which was a Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage. And again, we find a picture of really stalwart support. So if we look at the national data, we find that support has gradually increased over time, from 54% in 2014 to a decade later, 2/3 of Americans saying they support same-sex marriage rights. Here, what's interesting, though, is that even though we still have party polarization, we've even seen increases among Republicans who say that same-sex marriage rights should be supported. So it's not a majority, it's right at the cutoff point, 50%, but that's higher than it was in 2014 when only 35% of Republicans supported same-sex marriage. And again, much like the other case, Democrats continue to have more support for same-sex marriage rights over time as well. And finally, when it comes to support for same-sex marriage by religious tradition, I sound like a broken record, but we're finding that most people of faith actually do support the rights of same-sex couples to be married. Not all people of faith, of course. We find, for example, that Hispanic Protestants, white evangelical Protestants, Muslims, and Jehovah's Witnesses are the least supportive. Like fewer than half of members of those faith traditions support same-sex marriage rights. But again, on the whole, the religious picture is one where most people of faith support same-sex marriage. And again, if you look at the heat map, we find in the Deep South is where you tend to have less support for same-sex marriage. But I would note, if you take time to look at the map and kind of look at it in greater detail, in no state do we have fewer than half of state residents saying that they are supportive of same-sex marriage. I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. Lastly, we decided to ask a couple questions through the year about laws that pertain to some aspects of transgender rights. We're going to talk about this with Kelsy a bit more here, but really quickly, we asked about opposition to laws restricting gender-affirming care for minors. And we find that we have asked this question a couple times since 2022, and there is a slight conservative I think, shift when it comes to opposition to those laws that restrict gender-affirming care. So in other words, we're finding that Americans are growing more likely to say that those laws should be allowed. Not a majority of Americans, however. But notably, there is some dissipation of support for or dissipation of opposition to those laws, even among Democrats, although the overwhelming majority of Democrats still oppose those laws that would prevent parents from getting gender-affirming care for their children. And from the religious angle here, we find that Unitarians, American Jews, those who are religiously unaffiliated, Hindus, especially those folks from minority faith traditions in the US, tend to be the most opposed to laws that restrict that availability for parents to receive gender-affirming care for minors. And we see, though, that among white Christians and among Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Latter-day Saints, we see that there is actually less opposition to those laws. And finally, the last question we decided to look at, which has become, I think, a little bit more germane in wake of the Trump administration and their proposals with respect to forms of government ID, is we looked at how Americans felt about opposition to IDs displaying sex at birth rather than gender identity. Here we find actually that Americans are less likely to oppose that than they were, in fact, to oppose laws that prevent parents from getting gender-affirming care. So we found that only 37% of Americans oppose those laws. And again, it greatly varies depending on partisanship. And really quickly, the religious picture that we have here is that we tend to see the same sort of dimensions we saw earlier. Folks from more minority faiths tend to be the more opposed to these laws, as opposed to folks like white evangelical Protestants. Only 15% oppose laws that have residents in states displaying their sex at birth rather than gender identity on their forms of ID. So that was the major findings. Whew, that was a lot, but I want to turn it over to Kelsy for her insight and some of her thoughts about what our report is revealing today. Kelsy.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be back with PRRI. I'll just point out maybe three things that expand on your really helpful overview. And you mentioned this at the beginning, which is just the power of this survey instrument. Over 22,000 respondents from all 50 states. I grew up in the state of Wyoming, the least populous state in the country, and now live in Nebraska, which is, flyover country. And so I just think that this representation is so important, especially given the political landscape in which we live, where like this red state, blue state divide really matters when it comes to what kinds of laws dictate our daily life. So to be able to see that deep dive in all 50 states, I think is so important. And I encourage people to look and see, where their states land when it comes to these issues. The other thing that I thought was interesting, when you presented the different dimensions of LGBTQ respondents in the survey, you point out that LGBT folks are much more likely to be unaffiliated with religion than are their straight counterpoints. But I think one point that can easily get lost when emphasizing that finding is that, many LGBT people have a continued attachment to religion. So 46% of LGBT Americans responding to the survey say that they are affiliated with religion. And I think this is especially notable given how often religion can be unwelcoming or hostile to queer folks, that many still have found a place within religious communities. And maybe the final thing I'll point out, which was one of the things I found interesting about this report and others that, continue to come out from PRRI, is that it's really hard to generalize about how people feel about LGBT people, identity, relationships, various measures of rights, because it really matters the questions that we're asking about. So we see really different responses when we're asking about measures having to do with transgender people compared to things like marriage, compared to things like employment discrimination. So we see, about 30% of all Americans still oppose the legality of same-sex marriage, but 40% think that religious business owners should be able to refuse service to gays and lesbians. Only 20% oppose non-discrimination protections for LGBT people. So these kinds of nuance across these measures, I think, are really important to highlight. So I'm going to ask a question now, which is, so one of the things that I was really curious about in seeing this report that has come out in early 2025, but from data that was collected in 2024, 2025 in many ways feels like a whole new world when it comes to the Trump administration and so many executive orders and policies that are affecting LGBTQ people. So how should we make sense of these survey findings from last year when they were collected, given the world that we live in right now?
I think that's a really great point. I would also add to that, it's not just the Trump administration, I think, reversing a lot of protections for LGBT Americans, particularly trans Americans, transgender Americans. But, we have, of course, the state of Iowa actually revealing a protected class when it comes to transgender Americans, right? So I think there's political momentum on the right to try to have a reversal of some of these policies. But what really strikes me is that we don't find, I think, broad support for those measures at all in our data. And I think I'm just really struck by the kind of stasis, or sort of the remaining relatively high levels of support for non-discrimination protections for same-sex marriage. We're not necessarily seeing, I think, a wholesale shift when it comes to Americans' attitudes on these policies. Now, will that change in the year ahead? I don't know, but I strongly suspect not, because, Kelsy, I'm sure you would agree, we've spent a lot of time looking at this kind of data, and I don't think that there's necessarily indications that we're seeing lots of changes. I think what the survey does reveal, and one of the things that maybe we can talk about as well, is that the need for better questions about parsing out discrimination protections for maybe gays, lesbian, bisexual people as opposed to transgender. That's a trend I think that we need more data and research on. But I'm still kind of struck with how remarkably, I would say left of center or progressive people are toward the rights of many queer Americans. And so it seems like the policies we're seeing are really out of step with most Americans today. I'm going to return to a question for Kelsy, actually. Last spring, you wrote about what you perceive as the myth of the woke university, one that critics often say are promoting an LGBTQ agenda on campuses. So I just kind of wanted to get your sense that, and really when it comes to younger people, we haven't really talked about that as much, but we have seen sort of a plateauing effect, if not a little bit more of a conservatizing trend among some young people. They still tend to have overwhelmingly large levels of support, but looking under the hood, we've seen some younger Republicans trending more Republican to more conservative, and that's kind of brought the national average down in some of our measures, at least. So I just wanted, from your perspective of being on campus, Kelsy, as someone who also is looking at younger Americans, how would you characterize Gen Z's position on LGBTQ rights from your studies and from your role as a college professor today?
I'll attempt to answer that question, knowing that you, I think, are the expert when it comes to Gen Z. But I do, so as was mentioned at the beginning, I teach at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Right now in my state, in my university, it feels like being confronted with new announcements about new levels of budget cuts at the university and also coming from the state. From the state legislature, we are experiencing proposed laws to eliminate tenure, to ban any programming related to diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. So I think for those of us who work on the ground in higher ed, especially at public institutions, especially in red states, certainly don't perceive our work environments as like the hub of the quote unquote woke movement. So I wrote a piece about a year ago that spoke to some of these issues. I think this is as relevant now as ever. But my perception is that it feels like conservatives are largely calling the shots when it comes to the day-to-day operations at universities. And I see great diversity among my students when it comes to their political beliefs about LGBT issues and other things. It's true that I think this is a generation where many people are exploring their own sexual and gender identities and have a more expansive view than older generations, as you spoke to from the overview of the findings. There's more visibility of queer people than ever before. But I think at the same time, it's really important to recognize that the conservative movement, and specifically what we call sort of far-right organizations, have really targeted young people with anti-LGBTQ messaging. So Turning Point USA is one, big example of this. Charlie Kirk's organization that has formed chapters on college campuses all across the country and gets millions of dollars to support their cause. Social media, too, is a place that young people are heavily involved, and we see some of the strongest opposition and also misinformation to queer people. So there's a lot of sort of push and pull factors that I think make it hard to generally categorize young people and their positions. And I'm curious, just to return the question to you, like, how would you categorize Gen Z's position on like placing LGBTQ rights in comparison with other political issues from your research? What have you learned about this?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue. Again, I think it bears repeating that most young people, still support non-discrimination protections, like 73% from our study. 61% oppose religious refusals. 68% support marriage equality. But on other issues, generally speaking, I would say Gen Z tends to be more left of center than right of center, certainly. So whether it's, for example, we found in our own research that a majority, 3 in 4 Gen Zers, back government relief from student loan debt. Even a majority of Gen Z Republicans, we find that Gen Z Americans are far more supportive of government action to address climate change than other Americans and older Americans. We find also that more than 6 in 10, 67%, in fact, of younger Americans say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And looking at some recent Pew data, we find, generally speaking, young adults want more of a larger role for government to solve problems, right? So this is not the embodiment of a generation turning far more conservative with respect to the size and scope of government or with respect to social issues. And so I think that's kind of important to keep in mind. But as you noted, I think there's headwinds when it comes to fighting on college campuses, because you have a very well-resourced group of more, I think, conservative leaning organizations like Turning Point, who have really spent a lot of time trying to change people's opinions on that. But I don't think there's anything in the data suggesting that even near a majority of younger Americans are supporting those policies necessarily. All right, so in terms of broader LGBTQ rights here, I think one of the things that we're trying to unpack as scholars is really thinking about what about support for transgender rights today? I mean, I think we do find more mixed evidence on the questions that we asked, but what is your sense, Kelsy, on sort of the state of public opinion when it comes to support for transgender rights among Americans today?
Yeah, I think the report that came out, and as you described some of the data, can make it seem like a stark contrast when it comes to Americans' attitudes about trans people when comparing attitudes to LGBT people. But I think for context, the first thing I would say is that we actually don't necessarily know about really long-term trends when it comes to attitudes specific to trans people, because public polling just wasn't really asking these questions, say 15, 20, 30 years ago. We've had questions for a really long time, since at least the 1970s, national surveys that asked about, whether people believed in homosexuality as being morally right or wrong, and things like same-sex marriage. So we just don't really have the comparables when it comes to trans people. So that's one sort of caveat. I do think there's no disputing, though, the fact that the conservative movement, especially since Obergefell, which you pointed out, that the conservative movement has pivoted to target and attack trans people explicitly instead of, or maybe in addition to, LGBT people. But none of these tactics are necessarily new. So we've seen these before. We've heard about bathroom panics. We've heard about fear over teachers and classrooms, this kind of protect the children rhetoric. This was all present many decades ago, in the 1970s, the 1980s. Back then, the attacks that were being propelled by the Christian right, I think, conflated trans and gay people as more or less one and the same. So trans women were just assumed to be sort of under this broader umbrella of homosexuals. So these are the same kinds of tactics and messages, but they do appear to be working to some extent in recent years when it comes to targeting transgender people. And one of the things that's interesting is that even if the messages among the right are being recycled and reused, I don't think that progressive groups, including like national LGBT groups, can simply repeat their same messages, like just making sure to add on the T along with the LGB. And we see that from this report in particular, that even among progressive or centrist groups like Democrats or independents, that their opposition to trans rights might be increasing. This is especially true in the context of healthcare access for trans minors. Also, we see that often in other surveys when it comes to sports team participation. And I think this also shows up, it's worth noting, when we ask LGBT people about their own political affiliation. So in this report, one of the things I noticed was that roughly the same percentage of LGBT Americans are Democrats as they are Republicans or independents combined. So there's clearly some resistance there to the Democratic Party or the sort of status quo established progressive movement. So all of this says to me that I think progressives need to think really deeply on how to best counter messages from the right, and in particular to listen to and learn from trans people themselves. We see these attacks playing out in so many different fronts. It's sort of hard to keep up at times. Schools and education, legal recognition, medical care, incarceration. And knowing, opening up the news every day, I observe this. And I was thinking as we were preparing for our conversation, just how do you approach this as a research organization, deciding which questions to ask, how to keep up with political trends, how to decide how to word these questions? I'd love to hear how you balance being able to measure things over time and continuing to be relevant with the latest issues.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think, as a researcher, Kelsy, there's such value in trend data that you want to kind of monitor where folks are going, and to get rid of some trend questions sometimes. And occasionally you might need to tweak some of the wording of a trend question, but it's, the decision to actually stop to stop having that question be on a survey, is pretty, it can be hard. That can be a hard call to make. But I think, for example, the General Social Survey is one of these great surveys where we've asked questions about all kinds of things in American public opinion for decades. They used to ask a question about, would you vote for a woman for president? And so they asked it for decades. And then finally, they had 96% of people saying, yes, if my party nominated a woman, I'd vote for her. So they decided to drop it because you had almost near unanimous support in a survey, at least, suggesting it. So I think that's kind of one indicator where you might want to drop a question. But we also have to be mindful that politics is happening on a daily basis. And we need to provide the public, we need to provide lawmakers and journalists and educators with a good snapshot of where Americans are. And so we're pretty consistently monitoring what's happening in state legislatures, what's happening in Congress, what's happening in the executive branch for really sources for questions that really kind of help us to understand the moment where we are in. So I can't believe it's already 12:30. Oh my goodness. So that went by so quickly. We could have kept going, Kelsy, for another half an hour, but I really appreciate your thoughtful remarks and reflections about the survey. I encourage those who are watching at home, please go online, dig into the data. There's much more analysis in our report, but thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Melissa. Take care.